All right, basic HTML and CSS lesson 6. Congrats to those of you that have made it this far. Now comes the fun part. So we're going to start in on CSS. We're going to actually get to make our websites look pretty, make them usable. This is the fun stuff in web design. So really excited for this video. Let's get going. So our learning objectives for today, to learn the basic syntax of CSS. So it's a little bit different, not a little bit, it's a lot bit different than HTML. It's a completely different syntax. And so you're gonna have to learn the syntax before we get rolling. And then we'll begin styling up our practice portfolio site. So let's get going. What we'll need is a web browser as always, our text editor of choice, and the lesson 6 zip file, which is optional. You could also just be following along on your own local file. So before we actually start in on some code, CSS is a completely different syntax, which also, you could call CSS a language. And I think a lot of people would call it a language. And so the syntax for CSS basically has three major elements. The first is the selector. Okay, so the selector, this is where all of those HTML tags are going to look familiar to you. So selectors can be any HTML tag. They can be any HTML class, or they can be any HTML ID. And so the selector will be obviously very important to sort of target the thing that we want to change the visual design of. Okay, so in this case, our selector is an H1. So if we were to write this in a CSS file, we would make changes to every single instance of heading 1 across the entire website. So we would say H1, our property. So the second piece of CSS syntax is properties. And these are the hardest things for beginners because you just don't know what the properties are. But I will link in the lesson a library or dictionary of CSS properties. It's less important that you memorize them all. It's more important to kind of think about all of the different things you could possibly change on any given HTML element. Okay, so like for a heading, everything you could change is you could change the background of the heading, you could change the color, the font color, you could change the font size, you could change the font family, you could change the alignment of a heading. So those are all things that you could do, and you can even just maybe even in your mental schema, think about what could I do in Microsoft Word with a heading? Well, anything you could do in Microsoft Word, you can do in CSS. The hard part is knowing that like you need to use font-family if you want to change the font family, or font-size if you want to change the font size. You can't just, choose any property and call it size. It's just not going to work that way, right? So there is a sort of learning curve in learning some of these properties. But in terms of what you can do with CSS, you can really kind of think of it as you can do anything that you would be able to do maybe in Microsoft Word, and probably more. So in this example, we have a property, which is color, and then we have a value that defines what the property will be. So we're defining the color of our selector as green. And then we have another set of properties and values. And one thing that I didn't add on this slide, but sets of properties and values are also referred to as declarations. Not to get, the semantics don't really matter that much. But just know, you need to select something, you need to choose something to change, and then you need to define what you want that change to be. Font size is another property. and then our value in this example is 30 pixels. Okay, so we would set, this would be a green large piece of text for our H1 or heading 1. The other thing I will point out is you can use, or you can select any CSS class, or I'm sorry, HTML class or ID. So those classes we created are going to be really important in helping us target specific parts of our website. So the last thing I want to show you before we get into code is where we left off. There is and I will link to this in the lesson itself, but there is something called the CSS box model. Okay, this is pretty important to kind of wrap your head around. And I don't want to get overly technical about it. I'll kind of teach you as we design, because I find that you probably get confused because it probably won't make too much sense. But what I will point out is if you look at any given HTML element, so let's pull up our HTML. If you look at any given HTML element, so for example, this nav, it has an invisible box drawn around the element. So every single element is basically a rectangle on the page. So that helps you as you think about visualizing and designing. So there's a rectangle around our navigation. There's a rectangle around our unordered list. There's a rectangle around each of our list items. There's a rectangle around each of our anchor tags. Okay. Same with images, same with headings, same with every single, basically every single HTML element has a rectangle that's sort of invisibly drawn around it. That's going to be helpful to understand when we start to think about things like spacing things out, when we think about things like laying things out into multiple columns, when we think about adding or removing space, to the top, bottom, left, or right of each element. So some important things to think about. All right. So let's get rolling. Where we left off is our index.html looked like this. Okay, so we had our our navigation, we had our hero section, our main content section with 4 placeholder portfolio items, and then our footer section. Okay, looks pretty ugly, but that's what CSS is for. So now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create a CSS file. So I'm going to go into Sublime Text, or you can use whatever text editor you're using, and you're going to create a new file, and then you're just going to save it as, and I'm going to save it in this folder, style.css. Let me make sure I'm in the right folder. Yep, video 6. So style.css, and that .css is important. You have to have that .css in order for this to be read or recognized as a CSS file. Okay, so we've created our first CSS file. It's blank for now. The next very important thing we need to do is we need to connect our CSS to our HTML file. Okay, so these don't magically connect with one another. So what we'll do is inside of our head tag at the very top, we are going to create what's called a link tag. And I actually always get this wrong, so I'm going to look this up. W3 schools link tag. And I am going to copy some of the syntax here. So link, and then relationship style sheet, and then href style.css. Okay, so once we do this, and then you'll have to know if you've got more than one page on your website, you have to add this link in your head tag multiple times. Okay. So now we've got these two things linked up. What we can do is we can do our first bit of style just as an example. So we'll delete this style, but let's change this heading to. So we're gonna go to H2, and so again, let me just remind you of the syntax. So our selector is H2. We're going to open curly brackets, and kind of like HTML, every curly bracket that opens must close. So we're going to close it. And I like to do it vertical as opposed to horizontal. And I like to put each declaration on its own line. So line break in between declarations. Okay. So I'm just going to do font size 60 pixels. Okay. And I'm going to make them huge. And that didn't work. Oh, that's because this is the wrong HTML file that's loaded. Let me reload the index here. There we go. And 60 pixels. Let's make it even bigger. Let's make it 160 pixels. Gigantic, right? So a couple things about units in web design, and we're not gonna have time to go over, all of the units. But pixels are the most common, especially when we're thinking about font sizing. I actually like to use relative M, the relative M unit, which gives you more of a responsive style, but we'll just stick with pixels for now. Pixels are larger than points that you would normally use in, is that right? Or are they smaller? Let's make sure I'm right on that. Point to pixel. Pixels are, yes. So they're smaller than points. So like 12-point font, normal 12-point font that you would find in Microsoft Word or whatever is equivalent to 16 pixels. Okay. So it's roughly, I don't know the math. 20% larger, smaller. So just know a very typical sort of way of thinking about font sizing though is, your paragraph text, your link text, your normal reading text should be around 16 pixels. Heading 1 should be roughly around twice that, 32 pixels. Heading 2 should be roughly around, 1.75 x. So that's what, 32, 26, something. Excuse my math. It's probably not exactly right, but that's what 26 pixels looks like for a heading 2. But let's keep it at like 90 because we like it really big. It looks cool. But one thing with CSS is once we've declared that all heading 2s are font size 90 pixels, the issue now is going to be when we get down to our project titles. So now our project titles are gigantic too. And that's a problem. And so we definitely don't want that to be true. We definitely want to vary those things. And so the beauty of CSS is you can create, again, your own classes, right? So we've defined each of these sections. And so now what we can do in CSS is we can say, let's style up the H2 in this section different than the H2 in the main content section, for example. So what we can do is we can select the class, and to select a class in CSS, it's a dot and then the class name. So our class name is hero-section And then anything after this will relate to the class that we selected. So basically we're saying H2s in the hero section, let's make the font size 90 pixels. So if we save that, this remains 90 pixels. These other ones shrink back down to their default font size. Okay, so pretty cool already. One thing I will show you is how to comment in CSS. Commenting is good, again, to keep your document nice and neat. So to comment, you / and star, and then you write the comment. So I'm just going to say hero section styles, and then to close your comment, it's star / So what's cool about Sublime Text is it'll tell you if it'll be in color if it's active, but if you have some kind of comment and I commented this out, none of this stuff is going to be active anymore. So it kind of reminds you, here's where you need to close your comment in order to style things up properly. Okay, so we've made our first change, which is cool. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to come back to our sort of inspirational site. And this looks a bit smaller than 90 pixels. I'm going to go a bit smaller as well then. I'm going to go 70. And then this is pretty much this, not pretty much, this is exactly the same size. I don't think I'm going to make the my title, my job title, the same exact size. I think I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. So I'm going to say hero section H3, which is, now we're targeting this bit of text. I'm going to make the font size, let's say 60. Let's see what that looks like. See, that looks a little too big for my taste. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bump this down to 40. I think I like that a little bit better. And I don't like this huge gap between these two bits of text. The reason for that gap is that headings automatically have margin on the bottom. So like, remember when I said every HTML element is basically a box? Well, if you right click and you select inspect element, you can inspect and you can see that box. And in that box, you've got this orange stuff, and that orange stuff represents margin. So we've got a bunch of margin underneath our heading 2. That's what's causing, and a bunch of margin on top of our heading 3. So that's what's causing this space between the two elements. So what I can do is I can shrink that margin down. So our property is margin dash bottom, and we can just set that to 0. So let's set that to 0. And we can shrink down our H3, and you probably guessed it, margin dash top, we can set that to 0, and that's going to put these right next to each other. So again, he's got a little bit more space. I like it maybe a little bit, maybe we should space it out a little. So what I can do is you can add back in maybe 20 pixels of spacing, give it a little bit of room to breathe. I'm going to do one more thing to the hero section here, and then we will be done. I don't want to make these videos too long, but we're going to do one more thing here, and then we're going to move on to layout in the next video. So what I like about this is I like all of this space. It has a lot of room to breathe, and so I want to bump up the space in my hero section here. And so what I'll do is, if we look at our HTML, we have this div. And again, this div is just a box, right? So every element in HTML, again, is just a box. So there's this invisible box around my hero section. The height of the box is always just defaulted to the heights of the elements inside of the box. Okay, so again, if we inspect our box and we go to hero section, the default height you can see is exactly the height of the elements in our inside of our hero section, right? So the height would be bigger if these font sizes were bigger, and the height would be smaller if they were smaller. But right now it's just defaulting to whatever's inside of the box. But what we can do in CSS is we can, again, select our hero section, open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and we can declare a height. But I don't like to declare a height because I know that when the screen size changes, we don't want, if the elements are bigger than the height that we declare, it's going to spill over and it's going to get really messy. So there is a great property in CSS called min height, which stands for, you probably guessed it, minimum height. And what's cool about, what's really cool about Sublime Text is it will auto fill in properties for you. So like if you're thinking like, oh, I want to change the background color. I wonder if that's a, oops, I did this syntax wrong. That's why it's not working. I want to change the background color. I wonder if that is a property. You can see all of the different properties you can choose from. Oh, there's background color. We can change the background color. But for now, let's go to our min height and let's make it 400 pixels. I'm just picking a random number, but automatically we see that it's bigger. Okay. His is probably about that big. You know what I also noticed is, and I like this, a lot of modern websites go full width no matter what, but I like when you've got a really wide screen, only allowing it a maximum width so that your design doesn't get super stretched out. So I'm going to, how am I going to do this? I'm going to put a container around our entire HTML inside the body. So I'm going to add a div and I'm going to call it container. And I'm going to indent literally the entire web page, one tab. And I'm going to close that right before the body closes. And I'm going to do my exclamation mark dash dash, which defines the comment. And I'm going to say container. So that's where the container closes. Okay. So why did we do that? If we refresh, nothing actually happens. But what we can do is we can, in our CSS, we can call the class container, and we can set a maximum width. So just like there's minimum height and maximum height, we can set a maximum width. And it looks like his maximum width is probably like 1200 pixels. So that's what I'm going to go with. It's pretty common width is 1200 pixels. So because we don't really have anything in columns right now, we can't really see that container doing anything, but that will be helpful for us as we move forward. Now, one thing I'm going to do differently is I love his spacing, but what I don't love is I I like the minimalist sort of design, but I'm going to add a little bit of color, especially to this hero section here. So what I will do is I'm going to pull up a website called Color Mind, and it just gives you color schemes. And so I'm not a color theory expert, but I'm looking for something, you know, kind of modern and cool looking in terms of the color palette. So maybe this seems pretty, the Game of Thrones color palette. Let's try that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the background color of our hero section. So I'm going to go background dash color, colon, and then you can actually copy the hexadecimal code, which is a series of 6 numbers and letters that represent specific colors. And that's what these numbers represent, this color here. So I'm going to save that. And I am going to refresh. Cool. That looks cool. What I'm going to do now is, so now we can see our container in action, right? So this is the max width of this hero section is 1200 pixels. It looks weird though because it's pushed over to the left, and Dennis's website is centered, right? So when we make the window bigger on Dennis's, all of the content remains centered. And so we're going to want to do that. Otherwise, this is going to look really weird. So to do that on our container, we are going to do a little trick. And I probably won't explain this completely, but we can set our margin on the left and our margin on the right to what's called automatic margins. So if I set the margin on the left and the margin on the right to auto, it's going to take whatever is, however wide the viewport is, however wide your window is, and it's going to automatically put the same amount of space on the left and the right of the element. So when we do this, it should center everything up. Okay. So just like Dennis is here, that sort of centered up, ours is also centered up. Okay. Cool. Looks good. Now, one thing that I really like about Dennis's is, again, all of the space, the room for it to breathe. So one of the things that you're probably noticing is that there's not a lot of like space between, you know, this left edge and the rest of the elements in this particular div. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add padding to our hero section. So padding, so recall I said every HTML element is basically a box, right? So our hero dash section is this blue box that we created. And I might change this color, I don't love it. So that box, you can add margin, which adds spacing outside of the box. So if I added, let's add margin bottom 100 pixels. This is going to add 100 pixels of spacing outside of the box. So think about what's going to happen. I'm going to give you 2 seconds to think. Okay, hopefully you got this right, but it's going to push down this next element, and it's going to add 100 pixels of space outside of the box. Okay, so if we change this to 500, you can really see it in action. It added 500 pixels of space outside of the box. Okay, so that's what margins do. Padding, on the other hand, if we added padding adds space inside of the box. Okay, so if we refresh now and add 500 pixels of padding to the bottom, it added 500 pixels inside of the box. And since our box has this color already, it is just adding, you can see it adding it inside of the box. So margins outside of the box, padding inside of the box. Now, padding is really good for, and if you didn't know, you can do padding bottom, padding top, padding left, padding right. Okay, or you can do padding, and then you can define each of the top, right, bottom, and left with different values, right? So if you wanted to do 50 pixels at the top, 100 pixels on the right, 50 pixels on the bottom, and 100 pixels on the left, that would add padding all around this box here. Okay. That actually looks pretty good. So I'm going to keep that. I like that. So one last thing that we'll do that you might have noticed is we've got dark text on a darkish background. I'm going to change the color of the font. So if we go into hero section, since H2 and H3 are already inside of hero section, we can actually declare the color on hero section, and it should cascade down. That's what the CSS stands for. I failed to mention that. Cascading style sheet. It will cascade down to the elements inside of the hero section. Cool. That's a little bit too bright for me. There's a color called white smoke, and that's a little bit darker. You probably can't really tell the difference, but it looks a little bit darker. One thing that I'm noticing too is I don't really love the sizing here of our title. I kind of want the title to be on one line, so maybe I'll go 30 pixels. Let's see how that looks. I think it's okay for now. We're going to do some typography. We're going to add some fonts to this next. And that will be it'll make a big difference. You'll notice that once we start to change fonts, it makes a big difference on the design. So we've just styled up our hero section. We've learned about margins. We've learned about padding. We've learned about selectors. We've learned about properties and values. And we've just started to, play around with colors and things like that. So please feel free to play around with CSS, make some changes to some of the other elements if you want, or just move on to video 7 and we'll continue designing this to make this look as best we can.